She signed away her marriage with a smile on her face, and the judge, the lawyers, even her own attorney mistook it for surrender. It wasn't surrender. It was the exact moment Vivian Hale realized her husband's family had just handed her the one thing they could never take back. 6 hours later, Marcus Ashcroft, the billionaire patriarch who had once told her she'd never be worth the Ashcroft name, was standing on her doorstep in the rain, asking her, almost begging her, to come back. Not to the marriage. To something worth infinitely more than that. This is the story of how a woman they thought they'd emptied out walked away with the one piece of paper that could bring an entire empire to its knees, and didn't even realize the full weight of what she was holding until the people who discarded her came crawling back to find out. The Fulton County Family Court building smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax, the particular scent of a place designed to process the end of things as efficiently as possible. Courtroom 4C had seen 1,000 marriages dissolve inside its beige walls, but few with the specific theatrical cruelty on display that Tuesday morning. Vivian sat at the defense table in a plain gray dress she'd bought off a clearance rack 3 weeks earlier, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across the aisle, Julian Ashcroft sat beside 2 attorneys in suits that cost more than the dress she was wearing, checking his phone every few minutes as though the dissolution of a 9-year marriage ranked somewhere below his lunch reservation in importance. Julian was 38, heir apparent to Ashcroft Global Materials, a company that had quietly cornered the market on advanced polymer coatings, used in everything from aerospace components to consumer electronics. He had his father's sharp jaw and his mother's cold blue eyes, and he wore both features like inherited jewelry, proof of a bloodline he never let anyone forget. The terms are straightforward, his lead attorney said, sliding a folder across the table toward Vivian's court-appointed mediator. A lump settlement of $50,000, full waiver of any claim to Ashcroft Global equity or ongoing royalties, and Mrs. Ashcroft retains her maiden research portfolio, the Hale patents filed prior to the marriage. Julian actually smiled at that part, the kind of smile that revealed exactly how little he understood about what he was giving away. "Take the old patents, Viv," he said, not unkindly, "the way you might toss a stray dog a bone to keep it from following you home. Dad's lawyers say they're basically dead weight anyway. Filed years before you even met me. Expired provisional applications, mostly. It's a courtesy. Consider it closure." Vivian looked at the folder without opening it. She already knew, better than anyone in that room, exactly what was inside it. "I appreciate the courtesy," she said quietly. Her own attorney, a tired public defender named Ruth Okafor who had clearly seen this exact power imbalance play out 100 times before, leaned toward her and whispered, "Vivian, I need you to understand what you're giving up here. Ashcroft Global's market cap is $11 billion. You helped build the R&D division that got them there. This settlement is insulting." "I know," Vivian whispered back. "Then why are you smiling?" Vivian didn't answer. She picked up the pen, a cheap disposable one from the court's own supply, and signed her name at the bottom of the page. Vivian Hale, dropping Ashcroft from it immediately, the same way you'd shrug off a coat that had never quite fit. Julian's father, Marcus Ashcroft, wasn't in the courtroom that day. He never attended his son's messes personally if he could avoid it, preferring to let lawyers handle what he considered beneath his direct attention. But his presence hung over every sentence in that settlement anyway, every clause drafted by attorneys who answered to him first and Julian second. Vivian had met Marcus exactly 11 times during her marriage, by her own careful count. 9 of those times, he had called her the researcher instead of her name. On the 10th, at a holiday gala 3 years into the marriage, he had told her directly, over a glass of scotch he clearly assumed had loosened his filter appropriately, that Julian could have married someone with a name that opened doors instead of someone who spent her days in a laboratory smelling like solvents. The 11th time was the day he signed off on the divorce settlement without a single question about what the Hale patents actually contained. That, Vivian thought as she walked out of Fulton County Family Court into the gray Atlanta afternoon, was the single greatest mistake Marcus Ashcroft had made in 30 years of running one of the most profitable materials science companies in the country. She grew up in Macon, Georgia, the only daughter of a high school chemistry teacher named Robert Hale, and a nurse named Dolores who worked double shifts to make sure Vivian's college applications never had an asterisk beside them for financial aid. Her father kept a home laboratory in the garage, mostly harmless experiments meant to make chemistry feel like magic to a curious kid. But Vivian had inherited something sharper than curiosity from him. She had inherited patience, the specific kind required to run the same experiment 40 times until the anomaly you noticed on the first attempt either disappeared or revealed itself as something real. She studied materials engineering at Georgia Tech on a full scholarship, graduated top of her class, and by 26 had filed 3 provisional patents on a polymer stabilization compound she developed almost accidentally while researching corrosion resistance for a graduate thesis. The compound did something nobody in the industry had managed cheaply before. It allowed advanced coatings to remain stable at extreme temperature fluctuations without the brittle cracking that had plagued the entire sector for a decade. She filed those 3 patents under her own name, Vivian Hale, using nearly every dollar of her graduate stipend to cover the legal fees, 2 years before she ever met Julian Ashcroft at an industry conference in Charlotte. Julian had approached her after her presentation, charming in the specific way wealthy men are charming when they've never had to work hard to be noticed. He asked sharp questions about her research, questions she later realized had been fed to him by his father's chief technology officer sitting 3 rows behind him, quietly assessing whether the shy graduate student's patents were worth acquiring. They started dating within a month, married within a year and a half, and somewhere in the blur of a whirlwind courtship, Vivian signed a standard employment agreement with Ashcroft Global Materials that assigned all future intellectual property developed during her employment to the company, a completely normal clause that thousands of researchers sign every year without incident. The clause covered future intellectual property. It said nothing about 3 provisional patents filed 2 years before she ever set foot inside an Ashcroft laboratory. Julian's father never checked. That was the first mistake. Marcus Ashcroft had built an empire on aggressive acquisition and even more aggressive intimidation, but he had never once in 9 years bothered to have his legal team perform a basic due diligence review on the woman his son married, because he had already decided, the moment he learned she came from a public school teacher's household in Macon, that she wasn't worth the paperwork. Vivian spent the first 4 years of her marriage working directly under Ashcroft Global's R&D division. Technically employed, technically compensated, though her salary sat quietly below market rate for her credentials and her name rarely appeared on the patents her ideas eventually became. Julian's team took the stabilization compound she'd originally developed, refined the industrial application using her original provisional filings as an unacknowledged foundation, and launched what would become Ashcroft Global's single most profitable product line, marketed under Julian's name as lead inventor, with a small footnote crediting internal research contributions that never once mentioned Vivian Hale specifically. She noticed. Of course she noticed. But she also understood something Julian and his father never bothered to consider. The refined industrial version they'd built and patented under Ashcroft Global's corporate umbrella depended entirely on licensing rights to her original underlying compound. The 3 provisional patents that had since matured into full utility patents still held solely in her own name, patents she had quietly, patiently kept current and defended through annual maintenance fees she paid herself in cash, from an account Julian never knew existed. Ashcroft Global's flagship coating technology, the one generating nearly 40% of the company's annual revenue, was legally, permanently, and irrevocably built on a licensing arrangement that existed only informally within a marriage. No formal licensing agreement had ever been drafted because why would you draft a licensing agreement with your own wife? It had simply been assumed, the way wealthy families assume many things about the people who marry into them, that everything she had was already theirs. The marriage soured slowly, the way expensive things often rot from the inside while looking pristine on the surface. Julian grew colder as his own confidence, built almost entirely on credit for work he hadn't done, grew more brittle under industry scrutiny. He wasn't equipped to survive without her quietly correcting his mistakes behind closed doors. He began working later, drinking more, and eventually, predictably, seeing a marketing consultant named Chelsea whose photographs Vivian discovered on his phone during a routine software update she'd been asked to help him troubleshoot, an irony she still found darkly funny even now. When she confronted him, Julian didn't deny it. He simply sighed, the same exhausted sigh his father used when discussing underperforming subsidiaries, and said the marriage had run its course, that perhaps they'd simply grown into different people, that perhaps it was time for both of them to move on to lives that better suited who they'd become. Marcus Ashcroft's legal team drafted the divorce settlement within 2 weeks, moving with the specific efficiency of people who had done this before and intended to make the process as clean, as cheap, and as fast as possible. They offered Vivian a modest lump sum, framed generously as more than she was legally entitled to given the prenuptial agreement she'd signed years earlier, and as a final, almost mocking gesture of goodwill, allowed her to retain what their own due diligence team labeled, in an internal memo Vivian would later see during litigation, as legacy intellectual property of negligible ongoing commercial value. Nobody at Ashcroft Global Materials had actually read the patents in question closely enough to understand what they protected. They had simply assumed, because Vivian had never made noise about ownership during the marriage, that whatever she'd once filed had long since been absorbed into the company's broader portfolio through implication and habit rather than actual legal documentation. It hadn't. Not a single formal assignment or licensing agreement existed anywhere in Ashcroft Global's corporate records connecting the company's flagship coding technology to Vivian's underlying compound patents. She had checked quietly, methodically for 11 months before the divorce was ever filed, working with an intellectual property attorney in Savannah named Desmond Vance, a careful, unglamorous man who specialized in exactly the kind of overlooked corporate blind spots that made billion-dollar companies suddenly catastrophically vulnerable. "You understand," Desmond told her during their first meeting, sliding his glasses up his nose as he reviewed her original filings, "that if what you're telling me is accurate, Ashcroft Global has been operating their most profitable product line for 6 years without a valid, documented license to the core technology it depends on." "I understand," Vivian said. "That's not a negotiating position, Mrs. Ashcroft," Desmond said carefully. "That's an existential threat to an $11 billion company. Assuming the patents hold up under scrutiny, which, based on what I'm seeing here, they will." "I know," Vivian said again, and for the first time in the entire miserable process of watching her marriage dissolve around her, she felt something close to peace settle into her chest. She had signed the divorce settlement with a smile because she understood, in a way nobody else in that courtroom did, that she wasn't walking away with nothing. She was walking away with the single most valuable piece of intellectual property Ashcroft Global Materials had ever built its fortune on, and nobody in Marcus Ashcroft's entire legal apparatus had bothered to check. The first 6 hours after the divorce were quiet. Vivian drove back to the small rental apartment she'd secured in Decatur 3 months earlier, made herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window watching rain begin to streak down the glass, feeling, for the first time in years, entirely and completely her own. She had not yet made a single move against Ashcroft Global. She hadn't needed to. Desmond Vance had already sent, on her explicit instruction, a formal notice to Ashcroft Global's general counsel exactly 1 hour after the divorce was finalized, informing them that Vivian Hale, sole owner of United States patents covering the polymer stabilization compound underlying their flagship coating product line, would require the company to cease commercial use of the technology within 30 days unless a formal licensing agreement, with appropriate retroactive royalties, could be negotiated in good faith. The letter did not threaten litigation directly. It simply stated facts, cited patent numbers, and requested a meeting. It reached Marcus Ashcroft's desk at 4 in the afternoon, delivered by his own general counsel, who walked into his office looking, according to the assistant who witnessed it, like a man delivering news of a death in the family. Marcus read the letter twice. Then he asked his assistant to pull the original patent filings referenced in the notice, cross-check them against Ashcroft Global's own corporate intellectual property records, and confirm definitively whether any formal licensing or assignment agreement existed anywhere in the company's history connecting those patents to the flagship product line. The answer came back within 2 hours. There was none. There had never been one. 6 years of nearly $4 billion in cumulative revenue from the coating product line rested entirely on an unspoken assumption that had just been formally, legally revoked by the one person Marcus Ashcroft had spent 9 years dismissing as beneath his family's attention. At 7 that evening, as rain continued streaking down Vivian's apartment window, a black town car pulled up outside her building. Marcus Ashcroft stepped out without an umbrella, his 71-year-old frame moving with an urgency Vivian had never once witnessed in 11 prior meetings, and climbed the exterior stairs to her second-floor apartment himself, without an assistant, without his usual entourage of lawyers. He knocked. Vivian, watching through the peephole, recognized him instantly despite the rain plastering his silver hair flat against his skull, and felt something settle inside her chest that was neither triumph nor anger, but something closer to quiet, patient satisfaction. She opened the door. Mrs. Ash. He started, then caught himself, visibly recalibrating. Miss Hale. May I come in? You may say what you need to say from there, Marcus, Vivian said, leaning against her own doorframe with the calm authority of a woman who had waited a very long time for this exact conversation. Marcus Ashcroft, a man who had negotiated hostile takeovers against some of the sharpest corporate attorneys in the country, stood dripping on Vivian's doorstep looking, for the first time she had ever witnessed, genuinely uncertain of his footing. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding, he began, his voice carrying none of its usual dismissive edge. My legal team indicates you've filed notice regarding certain patents. There's no misunderstanding, Vivian said. I own the patents. Ashcroft Global has been using the underlying technology without a valid license for 6 years. That's not an interpretation, Marcus. That's simply what the documentation shows. The documentation, Marcus said carefully, can surely be resolved through proper channels. I'm prepared to discuss appropriate compensation for your contribution. My contribution, Vivian repeated softly, generated 40% of your annual revenue for 6 consecutive years. I'd like you to sit with that number for a moment before you use the word compensation again. Marcus's jaw tightened, old habits of control fighting against the new reality settling over him. What exactly do you want, Miss Hale? I want what I was always entitled to, Vivian said. A formal licensing agreement properly structured, with retroactive royalties calculated from the first commercial sale of the coating line 6 years ago, going forward at market rate for as long as your company continues using my technology. And I want it drafted by my attorney, not yours. That figure could run into the hundreds of millions, Marcus said, something close to genuine alarm cracking through his composure for the first time. I'm aware, Vivian said. I did the math myself 3 months before I filed for divorce, sitting at my kitchen table with a calculator, while your son was out with his marketing consultant and telling me the marriage had simply run its course. Marcus flinched, the first visible sign of genuine discomfort she'd ever witnessed from him. Julian doesn't know about this yet, does he? No, Vivian said. I imagine you'll want to be the one to tell him that his father's company just discovered it owes his ex-wife more money than most Fortune 500 companies see in a decade. All because nobody bothered to check whether the woman he married had actually protected her own work before he decided she wasn't worth the trouble of protecting. The negotiation that followed over the next several weeks reshaped Ashcroft Global Materials from the ground up. Marcus, faced with the alternative of an immediate cease and desist that would have devastated the company's primary revenue stream overnight and triggered catastrophic shareholder litigation, had no genuine leverage left to negotiate from a position of strength. Vivian, represented by Desmond Vance and a forensic accountant who calculated exact retroactive damages down to the dollar, secured a licensing agreement that granted her not just substantial backdated royalties, but an ongoing revenue share on all future products developed using her underlying compound, along with a formal named inventor credit on every patent filing going forward, something Julian's team had quietly stripped from her recognition for 6 years running. The settlement, once finalized, exceeded $400 million in initial payment alone, with ongoing royalty obligations projected to generate tens of millions annually for the remaining life of the patents. Julian, when he finally learned the full scope of what had happened reportedly, did not take it well. According to court filings from an entirely separate shareholder lawsuit that emerged months later, alleging Julian had misrepresented the company's intellectual property position to investors during 2 separate funding rounds, he attempted to blame his father's legal team for failing to catch the oversight during the divorce proceedings, a defense that satisfied approximately nobody, least of all the shareholders who had trusted his public statements about the technology's ownership structure. Vivian used the initial settlement not to disappear into quiet wealth, but to found her own materials science venture, Hale Innovations, headquartered in a converted textile mill outside Macon, close enough to her childhood home that her father, now retired from teaching, could visit the laboratory whenever he wanted and marvel quietly at the scale of what his daughter's patient curiosity had ultimately built. She hired researchers who reminded her of her younger self, funded scholarships specifically for graduate students from public school backgrounds who might otherwise never afford the patent protection necessary to safeguard their own work before a corporation or a marriage convinced them their ideas belonged to someone else. She named the scholarship program simply after the exact lesson she'd learned the hard way. The provisional fund, in honor of the unglamorous, unremarkable-sounding paperwork that had ultimately saved her entire future. Marcus Ashcroft called her twice more in the year following the settlement, both times with careful, diplomatic proposals suggesting Hale Innovations and Ashcroft Global might benefit from a formal strategic partnership, an alliance that would allow both companies to share future research and development costs. Vivian declined both times, politely but firmly, though she did eventually agree to a narrow, carefully structured supply agreement 3 years later, one negotiated entirely on her own terms, with her own legal team, and with royalty rates that reflected exactly what her work had always been worth. She saw Julian exactly once more, at an industry conference in Chicago nearly 2 years after the divorce. He approached her during a networking reception, looking older than his years, the easy charm that once opened every door for him now worn thin by a company reputation permanently marked by the scandal of his own oversight. "You could have told me," he said quietly, holding a glass of wine he wasn't drinking. "Before the divorce, I mean. You could have just told me what you owned." "I did tell you," Vivian said. "Years ago, at the beginning, when I mentioned my provisional patents during one of our first conversations. You said it was cute that I dabbled in that too. And then you asked whether I wanted to see the new restaurant your father had just invested in." Julian's face went pale, the specific memory apparently surfacing with uncomfortable clarity. "I forgot you said that," he admitted. "I know," Vivian said. "That was always the problem, Julian. You never once thought what I built was worth remembering. Right up until the moment you discovered it was worth more than everything else you'd ever been handed." She didn't wait for a response. She simply excused herself, crossed the room to speak with a promising young researcher whose independent battery coating patent had caught her attention earlier that evening, and left Julian standing alone with a glass of wine he still hadn't touched, the exact position she had once occupied for 9 quiet years of her own life. If you are listening to this and you have ever built something brilliant while someone else's name got printed above it, hear this clearly. Protect your work before anyone convinces you it isn't worth protecting. File the paperwork. Keep the records. Pay the fees yourself if you have to, quietly, patiently. The way you tend a garden nobody else believes is worth watering. Being underestimated is not the end of your story. Sometimes it's simply the exact condition under which your real leverage grows unnoticed, patiently, provisionally, until the day someone finally has to come to your door in the rain and ask for what they once threw away without ever bothering to check its true value. If this story of quiet strength and long overdue recognition resonated with you, let me know in the comments what you think Marcus Ashcroft should have done differently 3 years earlier. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe for more stories just like it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.